Hello everyone and welcome to this brief video. What we're going to do is just briefly recap what we have watched and learned and listened to over the last few months about the medieval period and history. So this is one of the broadest views of medieval history that we have talked about. So in AD 476 we had the collapse of Roman civilization around Europe. And so all of those European people who were dependent on Rome collapsed with it. Many of the advances, trade, language, economy, a lot of things collapsed with it. And the societies were thrown back into isolation. They had been united by their common leadership of Rome, and a lot of travel and connections between the peoples just suddenly dropped off, pretty much came to a complete end at this time. And this is what brings us into the medieval period, and that is again the collapse of Rome. It was a very hard time. Many people lived and died in very uncertain times between Roman civilization and restored monarchy and the restored travel. And it's a time when life is subject to a lot of chance and possibly could have been fairly scary. Not knowing and not having the same level of society and even culture that had been during the Roman era. And we're also talking about very different people. The Romans were Italian, they were Latin, they already had a cultural base from which they could grow on. Many of the people in Europe were from barbarian tribes and tribes which had moved and relocated into the areas in which they settled in France and Germany and throughout the various parts of the Roman Empire as a result of being pushed by other forces. And so many of them were also very new in the lands in which they were living. And so they were dealing with a post-Roman world and a post home era, if you will. And so they're making a new home without Roman guidance, and things would slowly reorganize. So from about 476 to 700, what we see are small local kingdoms and groups slowly gather back into larger and larger units of communities and beginning the re-emergence of nations, empires. A lot of them were just very isolated tribes at the beginning of the Dark Age. And as I said, there was very little communication with other tribes and with other peoples. And there was not so much a willingness to dominate over very extensive areas of land. You might dominate your immediate neighbors, but that was about it, especially in the 476 to about 550. Beginning about 550 into the 700s, we begin to see these dominant tribes gather a little bit more power and a little bit more power until they do begin to expand into recognizable territories. So then about 700 through 900, we begin to see the first post-Roman Empire, the Carlogingian or the Mergovian as well. So Mergovian, Carlogingian, the empire established by Pepin the Great and then going into Charlemagne, Charles the Great. And from 700 to 900, we see this expansion of these empires, and then all of a sudden they kind of rip apart again. And this process of expansion and then what we call fragmentation or breaking apart plays out several different times. And so it's just kind of reflecting a reality that things have not settled down. There are still shifting allegiances, shifting ideas. Europe is going through kind of growing pains. It's attempting to find its own identity and life after Rome. And without that unity being imposed on it, it's taking its time to develop it independently. And then from 900 to 1300, that is when we began to see and recognize things like the feudal system. And a lot of our class, a lot of our videos have focused in on social developments between 900 and 1300. I've tried to address some of that imbalance by going back and talking about Charlemagne and some of the earlier rulers, but again, most of our studies have taken place from 900 to 1300, simply because when you hear the term medieval Europe or medieval history, it is Europe at the time of 900 through 1300 that they really think of. And so it was important for me to define that era for you historically, and to make sure you had an accurate understanding of what that era in particular looked like. And as I put down here, and as I just said, this period is divided between the above three subunits. The Dark Age begins to end, and the later 600, 700, and really disappears with the increased power in the hands of a few and the consolidation and getting back to this recognizable, somewhat beginning form of empire and kingdoms, large kingdoms, kingdoms spreading over hundreds of miles, if not thousands of miles, rather than just tens of miles. So then we go from 900 and 1300, where we have a lot of structure. We have the feudal era, we have King John, we have King Henry V, Pope Urban II, we have the Crusades in this time period, Aragon, Castile, Leon, the Reconquista in Spain. All of these movements are beginning to push away some of that fragmentation, and there's something of a trajectory beginning to form where we can actually now see states forming that will become historical realities later on. So with the Reconquista beginning in 1212 AD and continuing on and off from that point all the way to 1492, we begin to see the unification of Spain and the eventual rise of a recognizable Spain. We also begin to see a recognizable France, as I've discussed with King John and his wars against King Philip II Augustus. We begin to see the separation of France and England out of a feudal relationship into sovereign nations. And so England becomes more isolated and more of a recognizable independent country. France also becomes more of a recognizable independent country. King Henry V is really the last king to really try to assert authority and power over the French in a feudal manner, and some would even suggest a quite futile manner, because he ends up dying at the very apogee of this process, and everything is totally reversed within 10-20 years of his death. France is once again just completely de-Anglicized. It has no English presence whatsoever in it. And then 1300 to 1400, we really begin to see very strong moves, not just in the government, but socially, economically, and in every other category. There's movement away from the feudal structure and into a period of limited monarchy, the beginning of nation states, and what we can recognize as the early mercantilist Western world system, as was brought out by several different historians. So this is, as I've said, a very, very broad view of history. In 1348, in the Black Death and afterwards, 1348 really is a pivotal date in European history. The Black Death strikes in 1348 and begins a process of breaking down feudalism. The church will go through a split, a schism. Christianity will have two popes for, I think, around about 100 years. There's two different popes, one in Avignon, France, and one in Rome. And you were able to kind of pick and choose who you were going to listen to as your pope, depending on the situation. And then again, we just continue to see the change in how kings are viewed and what the perception of them and their role is. And this will significantly change over time. So again, 900 through 1500, as I've said, repeatedly. This time, kings are absolute from 900 to 1200, and I needed to correct this on our previous test. 900 to 1200, kings are absolute and unchallenged. And the world in society is divided by one barrier, two levels: rulers and ruled, lords and peasants. There are no differences. There's no nobility, there are no knights, there are no degrees of separation. You are one or the other. Then, beginning about 1200, we begin to see through 1200 to 1300 and onwards that this breaks down. King John signs Magna Carta with the nobles at Runnymede and is kicking and screaming while doing so. But it becomes known, and it becomes well known to the French and to many other people. And like all of these ideas, it started slowly, it started small, but it gathered over time quite a bit of steam and eventually became the new system. 1300 to 1450, kings are now working in the new system fully. Some are still resisting the charters and limitations on their powers, some more than others, but again, the tide is really turning towards limited kings, parliaments, and even parliaments that kind of get to the point where they think that they're actually running things rather than the king. 1348. Mark this date down. Remember this date, 1348, Black Plague. Burns through society, kills 50 million Europeans. 50 million Europeans are killed. It basically upends the social system, and the feudal system never entirely recovers because everybody from every class is killed. Kings are killed, nobles are killed, knights are killed, peasants are killed, everybody's dying. And when you have that kind of great equalizing force, it will change all of society, and people who would have been in one class are called to be in another class, and so the social system became unbalanced. After the plague, we see political and social orders are changed, as I just said. This also results in an increase in scientific pursuit of scientific knowledge and artistic exploration, and as a movement come to be known as the Renaissance. And the Renaissance will vastly expand the knowledge and the cultural enrichment of Europe, eventually leading to bigger and brighter things. Thank you.